The sound of expensive crystal shattering against a 100-year-old oak floor has a way of stopping time. It was 8:17 on a freezing Thanksgiving evening in Colorado Springs. 25 relatives in tailored suits and silk dresses sat around my late father's dining table, their silver forks frozen mid-air. Outside, a blizzard battered the tall glass windows overlooking the lake. Inside, the air smelled of roasted turkey, expensive wine, and the sharp, metallic stench of long-buried greed. Karen Miller, my sister-in-law, did not even look down at the red wine spreading across the white rug. She stood at the head of the table, her diamond bracelets catching the chandelier light, her voice echoing off the high cedar beams with a brightness that sounded less like generosity and more like an execution order. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "Let us just clear the air before the gravy gets cold," Karen said, her tone carrying that effortless arrogance of someone who had never bled for anything in her entire life. The lake house, the investment accounts, the entire $2.5 million estate belongs to my husband, David. He is the eldest son. That was always the unwritten law of the Miller family. Sarah is just a paper pusher in the army. She spent her whole life eating off government rations and sleeping in barracks. She is living off her dead husband's pension, and she thinks she can just fly back from Europe and claim a piece of a legacy she never helped build. An uncomfortable murmur rippled down the table. My brother David, sitting beside her in a $5,000 Italian suit, did not look up. He stared intently at his polished fingernails, his silence giving her words his full, cowardly endorsement. My Aunt Clara glanced at me with something resembling pity, as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a country club and was about to be escorted out by security. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. When you spend 22 years in the United States Army Supply and Logistics Command, when you have managed $40 million worth of heavy armor through Poland in the middle of a sub-zero winter, you learn how to keep your heart rate at 60 beats a minute while everything around you catches fire. You do not shout at noise. You assess the threat, you secure your perimeter, and you wait for the enemy to walk completely into the kill zone. I took a slow sip of ice water. I felt the cool glass against my knuckles. Beneath my dress uniform jacket, my spine remained as straight as an iron rod. On my left lapel, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel caught the warm light of the room. I looked at Karen. I looked at David. And then I let a quiet, imperceptible smile touch the corner of my mouth. They thought they were holding a victory dinner. They had no idea that every single step they had taken over the past 3 years had been mapped, audited, and sealed inside a leather binder sitting quietly on the passenger seat of my rental car outside. To understand how my sister-in-law came to believe she could erase my existence with a single sentence, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to a dusty, wind-whipped tarmac at Powidz Air Base in Poland, where I was standing under the roaring engines of a C-17 transport plane, holding a red emergency leave folder while my father's heart was quietly giving up 5,000 miles away. My name is Sarah Miller. I am 42 years old, and for the last 2 decades, my life has been measured in shipping manifests, supply lines, and the weight of duffel bags tossed onto concrete floors. I joined the Army when I was 22, 3 months after graduating from Colorado State University. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 9 years old, leaving my father, Arthur Miller, to raise 2 young children while running a modest auto repair shop on Nevada Avenue. Dad was a proud man, a Navy veteran from the Vietnam era whose hands were permanently stained with motor oil and whose voice carried the steady, unyielding calm of someone who had seen the worst of the world and decided to respond with quiet work. My brother David was 3 years older than me. From the moment he could walk, David was the golden child. He had my mother's bright blue eyes and a charm that could talk a hardware store owner into giving him credit. While I was in the garage helping Dad clean carburetor parts and organize socket wrenches by metric size, David was on the high school football field, collecting applause and learning how to let other people clean up his messes. When I received my commission as a second lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps, my father sat on the porch of the lake house, holding my brass insignia in his calloused palm. He looked at the lake for a long time before he spoke. "Sarah," he told me, his voice rough from decades of breathing exhaust fumes. "The world is full of people who talk about building things, and a very few who actually carry the timber. Do not ever feel the need to shout about what you carry. The weight speaks for itself." I lived by those words. Through 2 deployments in Iraq, a tour in South Korea, and 3 years managing logistics at European Command Headquarters, I kept my head down and did the work. While David went into commercial real estate in Denver, married Karen, and bought a 4-bedroom house with an infinity pool he could not afford, I lived in base housing, drove a 7-year-old Toyota, and put 40% of my paycheck into conservative index funds. To my family, my life was an enigma they did not care to solve. Because I did not post photos of luxury vacations on social media. Because I wore plain clothes when I came home on leave. Karen quickly constructed a comfortable narrative about who I was. In her mind, I was the plain, unmarried younger sister who had fled to the military because I could not make it in the real world. I was the paper pusher. She loved that phrase. She used it at Thanksgiving dinners, at Christmas parties, at summer barbecues on the lake deck. "Sarah handles boxes for the government," Karen would say, waving her wine glass with a patronizing smile whenever someone asked what I did. "It is wonderful, really. The military gives structure to people who would otherwise get lost in the private sector." I never corrected her. I never told her that handling boxes meant overseeing a $200 million operational budget for a combat brigade. I never told her that my security clearance allowed me into rooms she would need a congressional subpoena to even read about. My father raised me to let arrogant people demonstrate their nature fully before you take action. Besides, I had more important things to worry about than my sister-in-law's fragile ego. 4 years ago, my father's health began to decline. Congestive heart failure is a slow, cruel thief. It starts with a little shortness of breath on the stairs, moves to swollen ankles in the evening, and ends with an old man sitting in a leather recliner, staring at an oxygen concentrator while his lungs fill with fluid. When the doctor told us Dad could no longer live alone at the lake house, David and Karen were the first to offer a solution. Or rather, their version of a solution. "We need to put him in St. Jude Senior Care in Highlands Ranch," Karen announced during a family meeting in Dad's living room, while Dad was sleeping in the other room. "It is $6,000 a month, but they have full-time nurses. David and I can manage the paperwork, and we can lease out the lake house to cover the costs." I sat across from her at the kitchen table, looking at the brochure she had brought. St. Jude's was a sterile, white-carpeted facility that smelled of bleach and industrial lavender. My father had spent 40 years looking at Pikes Peak from his porch every morning. Putting him in a carpeted box in the suburbs would have killed him faster than his heart. "No," I said quietly. Karen blinked, her smile tightening. "Excuse me. Dad stays in his house," I said, setting my pen down. "He built this place with his own hands in 1988. He knows every pine tree on this property. He is not going into a facility. And who is going to pay for 24-hour home health aides?" "Sarah," Karen snapped, her voice dropping the pleasant demeanor. "Do you have any idea what private nursing costs? David's firm is in a growth phase right now. We cannot just dump tens of thousands of dollars into home care." "I will cover it," I said. David looked up from his phone for the first time in an hour. "Sarah, you are an Army major. You do not have that kind of liquidity." They did not know that 3 months earlier, my late husband, Captain Mark Hawthorne, an Army aviator who had been killed in a training accident in Kentucky 4 years prior, had his military survivor benefits and life insurance final settlement cleared. Mark and I had no children. I had placed every dollar of that payout into an irrevocable trust, intended to buy a farm when we both retired. Mark loved my father. If he were alive, he would have handed over the keys himself. I did not explain any of this to David or Karen. I simply told them I had savings. For the next 3.5 years, while I was stationed in Germany and later Poland, I managed my father's entire life from 5,000 miles away. I paid $8,400 a month to a specialized veteran home care agency in Denver. I flew home 4 times a year, using every single day of my accrued leave. while my fellow officers spent their block leave vacationing in Italy or skiing in the Alps. I spent mine sitting in the waiting rooms of cardiologists in Colorado Springs, organizing pillboxes, and repairing the wooden deck ramps so Dad's wheelchair could reach the porch. David called Dad twice a month. The calls usually lasted 3 minutes and ended with David explaining why he could not make it down from Denver that weekend because of a real estate open house or a country club tournament. Karen visited twice a year, always bringing a store-bought pie, taking 3 photos for her Instagram page about cherishing our senior veterans, and leaving before the coffee was cold. My father was not blind. He knew exactly what was happening. In the summer of 2025, during what would be my final visit before my unit deployed to Poland, I was sitting with Dad on the porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the lake in deep shades of gold and purple. Dad was 81, his hands thin and liver-spotted, but his eyes were completely clear. He reached out and placed his hand over mine. His skin felt like old parchment, warm and dry. "Sarah," he whispered, his breathing shallow. "David is drowning." I looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean, Dad?" "He came here last Tuesday," Dad said, looking out at the water. Karen stayed in the car. "He sat right where you are sitting, and he asked me to sign a paper. He said it was a refi document for his commercial office. He told me it would help him lower his interest rates." My chest tightened. "Did you sign it?" Dad pulled a folded piece of paper from the side pocket of his wheelchair and handed it to me. It was a notary receipt and a copy of a deed of trust application. David had attempted to place a $850,000 second mortgage on my father's unencumbered lake house, using a forged power of attorney. "He thinks I do not understand numbers anymore," Dad said, a deep, quiet sadness in his voice. "He thinks because my body is failing, my mind went with it. He is broke, Sarah. Karen's real estate company is $3 million in debt, and David has been taking out private hard money loans to keep up appearances." I stared at the paper, my blood running cold. "Dad, this is fraud. This is felony bank fraud." "I know," Dad said softly. "I did not sign it. But I did not call the police either. He is my son, Sarah. I raised him in this house. But I will not let them destroy what took a lifetime to build." He reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in dark velvet. He placed it in my hand. It was a custom handcrafted wooden box made of dark ebony, fitted with a brass latch. "Take this to Robert Hayes," Dad said, referring to his longtime military comrade and attorney in downtown Colorado Springs. "Do not open it until the day comes. Robert knows what to do." "Dad." "Promise me." "Sarah," he interrupted, his fingers gripping mine with surprising strength. "Promise me you will not argue with them. Promise me you will let them show everyone who they really are before you open this box. Loud people build their own gallows, daughter. You just have to give them enough rope." I made him that promise on the porch that evening. 2 months later, while I was standing in a freezing motor pool in Poland, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was the home care nurse. My father had passed away peacefully in his sleep, looking out at the lake. The 3 weeks following my father's passing were a masterclass in calculated greed. I arrived back in Colorado Springs on emergency leave 48 hours after Dad died. Before I even had time to unpack my duffel bag at a local hotel, Karen had already changed the smart locks on the lake house doors and hired an estate liquidation company to appraise my father's furniture. She did not invite me to the initial funeral planning meeting. When I showed up at the funeral home anyway, wearing my service dress greens, she handed me a seat in the 3rd row, behind 4 of David's high-end real estate clients who had never met my father in their lives. I did not say a word. I sat in the 3rd row, my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. I listened to Pastor Miller speak about my father's honor, and I watched David deliver a tearful eulogy about how his father had taught him the value of hard work and family legacy. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. After the burial, Karen announced next to the gathered relatives that the formal family gathering would be held at the lake house for Thanksgiving dinner 3 weeks later. She framed it as a tribute to William's memory, but everyone in the family knew the real reason. She wanted to showcase the property to two wealthy investors she had invited under the guise of family friends. When Thanksgiving evening arrived, the snow was coming down heavy across the Front Range. I drove up the winding dirt road to the lake house in my rented Chevrolet sedan. The property looked magnificent under the fresh snow, the heavy timber beams, the stone chimney blowing warm smoke into the winter air, the wide porch where I had sat with my father 3 months prior. When I walked through the front door, the house did not smell like my father anymore. The smell of cedar, pipe tobacco, and old books had been replaced by aggressive lavender air fresheners and catering trays. Karen had hired a white-glove catering service from Denver to serve dinner. 25 guests were mingling in the vaulted living room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and 4 strangers in expensive suits drinking scotch by the fire. When Karen saw me step through the foyer in my military dress uniform, her eyes narrowed slightly before her face smoothed into that practiced, glossy smile she used for open houses. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of 3 cousins standing nearby. "You made it. We were not sure if the army allowed you leave for family dinners. You can put your coat in the mudroom down the hall. We reserved the main coat rack for the out-of-town guests." The mudroom was the unheated storage utility space behind the kitchen. I simply nodded, hung my heavy officer coat on a wooden peg near the door, and walked into the living room. My niece Chloe, David and Karen's 17-year-old daughter, was sitting quietly on the window bench, looking at her phone. Chloe was a perceptive, quiet girl who had spent the last 3 summers visiting her grandfather at the lake house while her parents were traveling in Europe. She was the only one in that branch of the family who actually knew who my father was. When Chloe saw me, she stood up and came over, giving me a tight, genuine hug. "Aunt Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Mom spent the last 3 days moving all of Grandpa's old military photo albums into the basement garage. She said they looked too cluttery for the dinner." I squeezed Chloe's shoulder gently. "It is okay, sweetheart. Photos do not change the truth. She is going to sell the house, Aunt Sarah," Chloe added, looking over her shoulder nervously. "I heard her on the phone last night with a developer. They want to tear it down and build 3 luxury condos." Before I could answer, Karen's voice rang out from the dining room, calling everyone to the table. The dining room was set with my late mother's fine china that Karen had taken out of storage without asking. David sat at the head of the table, looking puffed up and important in his designer jacket. Karen sat at the opposite end. They had placed me near the middle, sandwiched between a distant uncle who was half-deaf and one of Karen's developer friends who spent the first 20 minutes of dinner complaining about local zoning laws. Throughout the meal, Karen dominated the conversation. She spoke endlessly about David's expanding portfolio, about their upcoming trip to St. Bart's, and about how difficult it had been to manage William's affairs during his final years. "It was just so taxing on David," Karen said, taking a deliberate sip of her $80 Cabernet. "Running a high-volume real estate firm while constantly having to check on an elderly parent who refused to accept his limitations. But that is what eldest sons do. They carry the burden so others do not have to." My Aunt Clara nodded sympathetically. "It must have been so expensive, too. Nursing care is astronomical these days." "Oh, you have no idea," Karen lied smoothly, looking straight across the table at me. "Tens of thousands out of pocket." But David never complained. He just absorbed the cost. That is why William always intended for the real estate assets to pass directly to David. It is only fair, considering the financial sacrifice. I felt Chloe's eyes on me from across the table. I saw my Uncle Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. Everyone in the family knew David had been broke 2 years ago, but nobody wanted to challenge Karen's polished narrative. It was easier to eat the free turkey and nod along. I kept eating my dinner. I did not look up. I did not drop my fork. Then came 8:17 p.m. The catering staff began clearing the dessert plates, and Karen stood up. That was the moment she hit her wine glass with her silver spoon, sending that sharp, crystal ring through the room, followed immediately by her elbow knocking over her glass and sending a wave of red wine across the white tablecloth. And that was when she launched into her speech. "Let us just clear the air before the gravy gets cold." She delivered every word with surgical cruelty. She called me an eating baser off government rations. She called me a paper pusher living off a dead husband's pension. She publicly stripped me of my dignity, my service, and my place in my own father's house, all to ensure that the two developers sitting at the table understood that David was the sole, undisputed authority over the property. When she finally finished her tirade, the dining room was so silent you could hear the snow ticking against the window panes. David sat there, looking smug, adjusting his silk tie. Karen stood tall, her chest heaving slightly, waiting for me to break. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to yell, to make a scene, to prove to everyone present that I was the unstable, traumatized military veteran she had been quietly portraying me as for years. I set my cloth napkin neatly beside my plate. I looked around the room. I saw my relatives looking down at their laps, embarrassed. I saw Chloe staring at her mother with absolute disgust. And then I looked at the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. 8:21 p.m. "Karen," I said quietly, my voice calm, clear and perfectly modulated. "You have spoken for 10 minutes about sacrifice, about burden, and about my father's intent." Karen folded her arms, her chin tilted up. "I spoke the truth, Sarah. Someone had to say it." "Then let us make sure the full truth is on the table," I replied softly. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small set of brass keys, and set them on the wood table. Beside the keys, I placed the small, heavy ebony box my father had given me 3 months before he died. "Before we discuss who owns this house," I continued, "we need to wait for one more guest. He should be turning up the driveway right about now." Karen let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "What are you talking about? Nobody else is invited." I locked the gate. As if on cue, the deep, heavy rumble of a large V8 engine vibrated through the floorboards outside. Headlights swept across the frosted dining room windows, illuminating the swirling snow. A heavy door slammed shut in the driveway, followed by the firm, crunching sound of military boots marching up the wooden steps of the porch. The front door opened, and a cold gust of winter air swept into the foyer, carrying the scent of pine needles and fresh snow. Karen stepped toward the hallway, her face twisted in anger. "Who is coming into my house at this hour?" I explicitly told the security guard at the main gate. She stopped dead in her tracks. Walking into the dining room was not a local police officer or a confused neighbor. It was General Thomas Hawthorne, a 4-star general in the United States Army, wearing his full-service dress, blue uniform covered in rows of ribbons and silver stars that caught the chandelier light. Standing right beside him was Robert Hayes, my father's lifelong attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase stamped with the seal of the Colorado State Bar. Behind them stood 2 uniformed military escorts, their posture rigid, their brass buttons gleaming. The entire dining room went utterly, dead silent. You could hear the faint humming of the refrigerator from the kitchen. My brother David, who had spent the last 10 minutes looking like the undisputed king of the table, suddenly stood up so fast his chair screeched against the oak floor. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, waxy shade of gray. As a former ROTC cadet in college, David's body reacted before his brain even processed what was happening. His spine snapped straight, and his hands dropped to his sides in an involuntary stance of attention. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her diamond hand remained frozen in midair, her eyes darting frantically between the 4 stars on General Hawthorne's shoulders and the leather briefcase in Robert Hayes's hand. General Hawthorne did not look at Karen. He did not look at the catered food or the half-empty wine glasses. He walked directly past the long dining table, his polished boots making a steady, rhythmic sound on the floor, until he reached the spot where I was sitting. He stopped, came to attention, and delivered a crisp, formal military salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Miller," General Hawthorne said, his deep, resonant voice filling every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "On behalf of the United States Army Logistics Command and the Office of the Chief of Staff, I apologize for interrupting your family gathering." But your father's final trust provisions required my personal presence for this execution. I stood up slowly, smoothed my uniform jacket, and returned his salute. Thank you, General. The room is ready. Karen finally found her voice, though it came out 3 octaves higher than normal, trembling with a mixture of embarrassment and panic. Wait. What is the meaning of this? Who are you? This is a private family dinner. Robert, what are you doing here with military officers? We already sent you a letter stating that David is the sole executor under the family power of attorney. Robert Hayes set his briefcase down on the end of the mahogany table. He unlatched the brass locks with 2 sharp clicks that sounded like gunshots in the silent room. He took off his reading glasses, wiped them with a white handkerchief, and looked at Karen over the silver frames. Mrs. Miller, Robert said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The power of attorney document you submitted to the county recorder 3 weeks ago was flagged by the state attorney general's fraud unit 4 days ago. It was executed using a forged notary stamp while William Miller was hospitalized in intensive care. It is legally void, and it is currently the subject of an ongoing criminal investigation. Karen stumbled back a step, bumping into the sideboard. That is absurd. David is his biological son. He is the eldest son. He has the right. David has no rights under this estate, Robert interrupted calmly. He pulled a thick stack of audited financial documents from his briefcase and laid them out in neat, precise rows across the white tablecloth, right beside the spilled red wine. 3 years ago, Robert continued, addressing the entire room of stunned relatives, William Miller established the Arthur and Sarah Miller Family Irrevocable Trust. He placed this lake house, the surrounding 40 acres of land, and his liquid investment accounts inside that trust. The terms of the trust are absolute and unassailable under Colorado law. Robert lifted the top document. The trust explicitly states that control of the estate transfers upon William's passing not to the eldest child, and not based on birth order, but to the individual who fulfilled the financial, physical and legal obligation of his care during the final 5 years of his life. He looked directly at David. Over the last 42 months, a total of $395,000 was disbursed for William's round-the-clock medical care, specialized nursing, and house maintenance. Every single invoice, every prescription pickup, every home modification was paid directly from a military survivor account belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller. A sharp intake of breath echoed from my Aunt Clara. Uncle Richard leaned forward, staring at the bank statements spread across the table. Furthermore, Robert added, pulling out a second gold-sealed document, we have the complete financial audit of Miller Commercial Real Estate, provided under federal subpoena. 2 years ago, when David Miller's firm faced bankruptcy due to illegal hard money loans, it was Sarah Miller who quietly authorized a $300,000 collateral guarantee from her late husband's life insurance trust to prevent David from facing criminal foreclosure and public disgrace. The room seemed to tilt. My brother David looked as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He stared at me, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. Sarah. David choked out, his voice barely a whisper. You paid off the Denver lenders. I paid them off because my father begged me not to let his son go to federal prison while he was still alive to see it, I said, my voice steady and cold as Arctic ice. I paid it because I cared about Chloe's future, not your vanity. Karen was shaking now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust right in front of the 25 relatives she had invited to witness her triumph. No, this is a setup. You manipulated him. You used your military position to trick an old man into signing away his son's birthright. William Miller was not tricked, Mrs. Miller. General Hawthorne stepped forward, his voice cutting through her screeching like a razor. He was a former Navy petty officer who understood duty far better than the people trying to plunder his home. And 8 months ago, sitting right here in my office at Fort Carson, he recorded his final instructions. General Hawthorne reached into his tunic pocket, pulled out a small silver drive, and handed it to Robert Hayes. Robert plugged the drive into a sleek tablet he had placed on the table and turned the screen so it faced the room. The screen flickered, Static filled the small speaker for 2 seconds, and then my father's face appeared. He was sitting in his green leather recliner on the porch, wearing his faded Navy veteran cap and the flannel shirt I had bought him for his 79th birthday. He looked frail, his cheeks sunken, but his blue eyes held that same sharp, unyielding clarity that had guided my entire life. Hearing his voice again made a sudden, sharp ache bloom in my chest. I folded my hands tightly behind my back, digging my fingernails into my palms to maintain my composure. If you are watching this video, my father's voice filled the silent dining room, slow, gravelly, but steady. Then I am finally resting beside Linda, and Robert has called everyone into the dining room. And I am willing to bet a month of my pension that Karen is currently standing at the head of my table, telling everyone that David owns everything because he carries the Miller name. A faint, tired smile crossed my father's face on the recording. I want to say a few things plain, so nobody can twist my words after I am gone, Dad continued. David, my son, I loved you from the day you were born. I worked 60 hours a week in that shop so you could wear the best cleats, drive a nice car to high school, and go to college. But somewhere along the way, you decided that looking rich was more important than being honest. You let your wife convince you that family is something you use up and throw away when it gets expensive. On the screen, my father paused, taking a slow breath from his nasal oxygen tube. You came to this house 3 months ago with a forged paper, Dad said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with a father's heartbreak. You thought your old man was too blind to see what you were doing. You tried to put a mortgage on the home I built with my own hands, just to cover up your bad investments in Denver. You did not ask me how my heart was doing. You did not ask if I needed anything. You just wanted my signature so you could take what was left. David buried his face in both hands, his shoulders shaking violently as silent, racking sobs tore through his chest. Karen reached out to touch his arm, but David violently shoved her hand away, refusing to look at her. Meanwhile, my father's image turned slightly toward the camera, as if he were looking directly at me sitting at the table. Sarah was flying across the Atlantic Ocean every 3 months. She missed promotion boards. She gave up her leave. She spent her own savings. And she sat by my bed every single night when the pain got bad. She did not do it for this house. She did not do it for money. She did it because she is a soldier, and she knows what it means to stand your post. Dad leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his knees. This house, the land, and every dollar in the trust belongs to Sarah, my father said firmly. She earned it not by birth order, not by blood, and not by loud talk. She earned it because when the winter came, she was the only one who showed up. The recording went black. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My Aunt Clara was wiping tears from her eyes with a cloth napkin. Cousin Michael was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. Karen stood paralyzed against the sideboard, her face pale as a sheet, looking around the room at the relatives who had spent the last hour listening to her lies. Not a single person would meet her gaze. The 2 property developers she had brought as her special guests quietly stood up from the table, left their coats on the chair, and slipped out the front door into the snow without saying a word. I looked across the table at my niece, Chloe. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she gave me a small, brave nod. I walked over to the end of the table, picked up the small dark ebony box my father had given me, and opened the brass latch. Inside lay my father's Navy dog tags, his folded American flag from his service days, and an official deed transfer document prepared by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. I looked at Karen, my voice completely devoid of anger, carrying only the weight of absolute authority. You have 2 hours to pack your personal belongings and leave this property, I said quietly. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, a civil sheriff will be standing at the gate to enforce the trespass order. If you or David attempt to remove a single piece of my father's furniture, I will have General Hawthorne's legal team file immediate grand larceny charges with the El Paso County District Attorney. Karen looked at David, hoping for one last defense, but David remained seated, his head in his hands, completely broken. Sarah, David rasped out, looking up at me with bloodshot, hollow eyes. Please. I am your brother. I paid your debts because you were my brother, I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. My brother died the day you tried to steal from Dad. By midnight, the lake house was quiet again. David and Karen had packed their bags in complete silence and driven away into the snowstorm. Chloe had asked to stay behind with me, sitting by the stone fireplace in the living room while I brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, the same strong, dark roast my father used to drink every morning. General Hawthorne and Robert Hayes had left an hour earlier, after ensuring that all legal locks were secured and a private security team was stationed at the entrance gate. I stood on the wide wooden porch, wrapped in my officer's winter coat, watching the blizzard slowly subside over the lake. The sky was clearing, revealing a brilliant blanket of stars reflecting off the frozen water. In my hands, I held my father's dark ebony box. True revenge is not about destruction. It is not about screaming, or humiliating your enemies, or watching them suffer in the mud. I did not feel a sense of malicious victory as I watched my brother drive away into the dark. I felt only a deep, quiet peace, the kind of peace that comes when the noise finally stops, and the truth is left standing alone in the light. My sister-in-law thought she could erase 22 years of service with a single arrogant sentence at a dinner table. She thought that because I chose not to brag, because I chose not to wear my accomplishments like a billboard, that I was weak. She mistook my silence for submission, and my discipline for fear. She forgot the most fundamental law of the military. The quietest officer in the room is usually the one holding the coordinates. 2 months after that Thanksgiving evening, I officially established the Arthur Miller Veteran Family Preservation Fund. I transferred the entire $2.5 million estate into a charitable foundation that provides housing assistance, legal aid, and emergency medical funding for active-duty military members fighting to protect their aging parents back home. I kept the lake house. It remains a sanctuary for young soldiers returning from overseas deployments who need a quiet place by the water to heal, to breathe, and to remember who they are. Chloe comes down from Denver every weekend. She is studying pre-law at Colorado College now, and every Sunday afternoon, we sit on the porch together, looking out at Pikes Peak, talking about justice, honor, and the weight of carrying timber. My brother David called me last month from a small rented apartment in Aurora. His real estate firm had collapsed, and Karen had filed for divorce 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving incident. He did not ask for money. He simply asked if he could visit our father's grave on his birthday. I told him the cemetery gates are always open to people who are ready to speak the truth. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people you sacrificed everything to protect, if you have ever been forced to sit quietly while arrogant voices tried to rewrite your story, I want you to remember something. You do not need to shout to prove your worth. You do not need to lower yourself to their noise. Build your foundation in silence. Secure your evidence with discipline. And when the time comes, let the weight of your honor do the talking. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry inside, please drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from tonight. I read every single message. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Take care of yourselves, stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.